The judge's courtroom. The air in the judge's courtroom crackled with anticipation, thick and heavy as a summer storm. Benches, carved from dark, unforgiving oak, were packed tight with a motley collection of observers. Weary-eyed lawyers, nervous defendants clutching worn briefcases, and curious townsfolk eager for a spectacle. A low hum of hushed conversations filled the space, punctuated by the occasional cough or shuffle of feet on the marble floor. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, illuminating swirling dust motes and casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the room like restless spirits. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom as the heavy oak door behind the judge's bench swung open with a resounding thud. Judge Thaddeus Thompson. He was a mountain of a man, his presence filling the already imposing space. His black robes, meticulously pressed, seemed to absorb the light, making him appear even larger. A thick, silver mustache dominated his face, twitching slightly as he surveyed the room with eyes that could seemingly pierce through steel. He carried himself with a deliberate swagger, each step a pronouncement of his authority. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The assembled crowd scrambled to their feet, necks craning upwards as Judge Thompson ascended the 3 steps to his elevated perch. He settled into his leather chair with a sigh that seemed more like a grunt, his gaze sweeping over the room like a hawk searching for prey. Thompson was known for his swift, often brutal, judgments. He valued efficiency above all else, viewing the courtroom as a machine that needed to be kept oiled and running smoothly. He had little patience for lengthy arguments or emotional appeals, preferring to cut straight to the heart of the matter. But it was his laugh that truly set him apart. A booming, resonant sound that could shake the very foundations of the building. It was often deployed as a weapon, a means of intimidation, a way to silence dissent. Whispers rippled through the crowd, the name, Elias Thorne, surfacing again and again. Thorne, a young black man accused of stealing a loaf of bread. The details were scant, but the implications were clear. In this town, in this courtroom, a black man accused of stealing from a white merchant had little hope of a fair hearing. Judge Thompson rapped his gavel, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "Order! Order in my courtroom!" His voice, amplified by the acoustics of a room, silenced the murmuring crowd. "Let the proceedings begin." He shuffled through the papers on his desk, a disdainful frown etched on his face. "Elias Thorne," he announced, his voice dripping with barely disguised contempt. "Bring the defendant forward." Thorne, small and gaunt, was led to the defendant's table by a burly guard. His clothes were threadbare, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. He looked even younger than his supposed 20 years. Judge Thompson peered down at him over the top of his spectacles. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you stand accused of theft. Do you understand the charges against you?" Thorne swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, barely audible. "And how do you plead?" Thompson pressed, his impatience palpable. "Not guilty, sir," Thorne replied, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. A flicker of amusement crossed Judge Thompson's face. "Not guilty, you say? We shall see about that." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with a predatory light. "Very well. Let the prosecution present its case." As the prosecutor, a slick, ambitious man named Mr. Abernathy, rose to speak, Judge Thompson leaned his elbow on the bench and rested his chin in his hand. He looked bored, dismissive. He'd already made up his mind. He craved respect, Judge Thompson did, feared being seen as weak. He knew what people whispered, that he was a bully, a tyrant. But he preferred that to being thought of as soft. Better to be feared than pitied. He'd built his reputation on quick judgments, on maintaining order, on ensuring that things ran smoothly. A trial like this, open and shut, was exactly what he needed. He glanced at Elias Thorne, a shadow of a man, and a smile crept across his face. It wouldn't be long now. He could almost taste the satisfaction of another swift, decisive victory. The courtroom, his domain, his rules, his judgment. Soon, very soon, That booming laugh would echo through these very walls. Michael's humble plea, the scent of yeast and sugar clung to Michael Abernathy like a second skin. Every morning, long before the sun clawed its way over the horizon, Michael was in his bakery, Abernathy's, kneading, proofing, and shaping. The warmth of the ovens was a comforting embrace against the chill of the early hours, and the rhythmic thud of his hands on the dough was a meditative practice. He wasn't driven by profit, not really. He baked because he loved the way flour transformed into something nourishing, something that brought a smile to people's faces. He hummed softly as he worked, a tuneless melody that had been passed down from his grandmother, the original Abernathy baker. Sunlight, still weak and watery, began to filter through the frosted windows, illuminating motes of flour dancing in the air. Soon, the bell above the door would jingle, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Gable for her daily rye, or young Timmy Peterson for a still-warm cinnamon roll. But this morning, the bell didn't jingle. Instead, a harsh knock reverberated through the small bakery, followed by the scrape of the door being pushed open. 2 police officers stood silhouetted in the doorway, their faces grim. Michael's heart stuttered. He hadn't done anything wrong. Had he? He wrung his flour-dusted hands in his apron. "Officers," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Is everything all right?" "Michael Abernathy." One of them asked, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. Michael nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "You're under arrest for theft." The words hit him like a physical blow. Theft? Michael Abernathy, the baker who often gave away day-old bread to the homeless shelter. A thief? It was absurd. "Theft," he squeaked, his voice cracking. "But I don't understand." The officer produced a warrant. "Allegedly, you stole a loaf of bread from Miller's grocery yesterday afternoon." Michael's mind raced, trying to piece together the events of the previous day. He remembered. He remembered the flock of pigeons that gathered in the alley behind his bakery, their desperate coos echoing in the narrow space. He'd seen them huddled together, shivering in the cold. He hadn't had any stale bread on hand, so he'd walked down to Miller's, intending to buy a loaf. But when he reached the till, he realized he'd forgotten his wallet. I had to take a loaf," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But I was going to pay. I didn't have my wallet. I was going to bring the money back this morning." He explained about the pigeons, about how he couldn't bear to see them hungry and cold. He described the way they fluttered around his feet, pecking at the crumbs he scattered. "I feed them every day," he pleaded, his eyes wide and earnest. "They depend on me. It was just one loaf of bread. I swear I would have paid for it." The officers remained impassive. "Mr. Miller filed a complaint," one of them said. "He claims you ran out of the store without paying." Michael's shoulders slumped. Mr. Miller. He was a gruff man, known for his tight-fistedness. He probably didn't care about a few hungry birds. "Please," Michael begged, his voice thick with desperation. "Can't you just talk to him? Tell him it was a misunderstanding. I'll pay him double, triple, whatever he wants. I can't go to jail. I have to bake. People are counting on me." He thought of Mrs. Gable, of Timmy Peterson, of all the regulars who depended on his daily bread. The officers didn't respond. They simply placed handcuffs on his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. The scent of yeast and sugar, usually so comforting, now felt cloying and suffocating. As they let him out of the bakery, he looked back at the ovens, still warm and waiting. He hoped someone would remember to turn them off. Accusations and laughter. Judge Thompson's entrance split the tense silence of the courtroom like lightning. His dark robes swelled around him, an imposing declaration of judicial power. He didn't simply walk. He advanced, a rigid figure with a severe gaze magnified by thick lenses. His appraisal of the room was that of a predator sizing up its domain before he settled into his high-backed chair with a weighty finality. The gavel strike reverberated, an abrupt punctuation to the silence. "Abernathy, Michael," he announced, his attention barely grazing the documents before him. "Theft of bread. Care to enlighten us?" Michael rose, his pulse a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. The space felt immense, the collective gaze of the onlookers bearing down on him. He fought to moisten his parched throat, the taste of anxiety coating his tongue. The rehearsed words now felt like ash in his mouth. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely audible. He cleared his throat, trying again. It wasn't exactly stolen, sir. Mrs. Gable, her health has failed her, and her daughter, little Lily, hasn't had sustenance in days. I observed them, sir, through the bakery window. Lily was fixated on the loaves, her face pressed against the pane, and I simply couldn't stand by." He paused, seeking any flicker of understanding in the judge's expression, but found only a cold mask. "So, you found yourself unable to resist the siren song of baked goods." Thompson's tone was laced with derision. A modern-day philanthropist operating not from a forest, but from a bakery, and eschewing the wealthy, your target was bread itself. He chuckled, a dry, grating sound that echoed through the room. Michael's shoulders sagged. He had entertained the faint hope that his motivations would be understood, that the desperate circumstances would be acknowledged. "Your Honor, my intention was to compensate for it. I was simply short of funds at that moment. I fully intended to return the amount the following day, I assure you." Thompson leaned forward, his face a study in disbelief. "Intended to pay? Such commendable foresight. Were you also intending to sprout wings, Mr. Abernathy? We all know the fate of good intentions." He punctuated his words with another sharp crack of the gavel. Suppressed giggles fluttered through the spectators. Shame burned on Michael's face. He had never felt so exposed, so completely vulnerable. "Let me ensure my grasp of the situation is adequate," Thompson pressed, his voice now amplified with mock wonder. A grown man, witnessing a child's yearning for a simple loaf, responded by engaging in petty larceny? Because that is the undeniable truth, Mr. Abernathy. The nobility of your alleged motives is wholly irrelevant. It remains theft. He formed a steeple with his fingers, his gaze unwavering. Furthermore, what precedent does this set for young Lily? That one may take what one desires, provided a sufficiently pitiable tale accompanies the act? That the constraints of the law are rendered moot by what? A baker with an overdeveloped sense of empathy. He unleashed a booming laugh that filled the courtroom. Michael's fists clenched at his sides. He yearned to protest, to articulate his reasons, to defend his actions, but the words remained trapped, stifled by the judge's relentless scorn. Tears pricked at his eyes. Thompson, sensing the shift, bore down. "You strike me as a delicate soul, Mr. Abernathy. Perhaps incarceration wouldn't suit someone of such sensibilities. But jurisprudence knows no exceptions, and the pilfering of bread remains the pilfering of bread. Unless," he paused, a shrewd glint now visible in his eyes, "unless you can furnish this court with a reason, suitably persuasive, to forestall the full weight of the law." Michael's mind raced, searching for a lifeline. What possible argument could sway this man, convince him that he was not a common criminal, only a man driven by compassion? He stared at his scuffed shoes, the crushing weight of the situation bearing down on him. His bakery, his livelihood, the very course of his existence, hung precariously, subject to the capricious whims of a judge who seemed to revel in his plight. He was ensnared, utterly without recourse. And the cruelest truth was that the bread, that singular act of kindness, had been worthwhile. He simply regretted, with every fiber of his being, that it had culminated in this courtroom drama. A door opens. Michael Abernathy choked back a sob, the sound swallowed by the cavernous courtroom. Judge Thompson, perched on his elevated throne, steepled his fingers, his gaze a cold, unwavering laser pointed directly at Michael. "So, Mr. Abernathy," he drawled, the mister, dripping with contempt, "you expect this court to believe that the theft was accidental?" Michael's throat was a desert. He tried to speak, to explain again the desperate circumstances, the medical bills piling higher than his meager income, his daughter's pleading eyes. But the words caught, trapped in the tightening vice of shame and despair. I didn't mean to," he finally managed, the words raspy and weak. I needed the money." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, quickly silenced by the sharp rap of the gavel. Silence. Judge Thompson barked, his face flushed. Mr. Abernathy, need is hardly a legal defense. You consciously, deliberately, and with malice aforethought, took what was not yours. Are you denying that fact? Michael flinched. Malice aforethought? He hadn't planned it. It was a moment of weakness, of desperation. He saw his daughter's face again, pale and drawn, and the stack of bills that seemed to grow larger every day. No, sir, he whispered, his head bowed. I don't deny it. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. Then perhaps you should prepare yourself for the consequences of your actions. The law, Mr. Abernathy, is blind. It does not care about your needs, your circumstances. It only cares about justice. Michael felt a tear escape and trace a hot path down his cheek. He swiped at it angrily. He was a failure, a thief, a disappointment to his daughter. He deserved whatever was coming. Suddenly, a low groan echoed through the room, like the sigh of an ancient beast awakening. All eyes snapped towards the back of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors, usually opened and closed with a respectful hush, were slowly, inexorably creaking inward. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Every conversation ceased. Even Judge Thompson seemed momentarily stunned, his gavel suspended mid-air. The doors swung fully open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the light streaming in from a hallway. She stepped forward, and the light caught her face, revealing high cheekbones and eyes the color of polished obsidian. She was tall, impossibly so, and wore a tailored suit of deep indigo that seemed to absorb the light around her. A single silver pendant, shaped like a coiled serpent, hung at her throat. There was an undeniable aura of power surrounding her, a palpable sense of authority that silenced the room. Even the bailiffs seemed to shrink back, their hands instinctively moving towards their holsters, then hesitating. She moved with a deliberate grace, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on Judge Thompson, who visibly shifted in his seat. Then, her eyes found Michael. He felt a jolt, an almost electric shock, as their gazes locked. There was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite decipher. Pity? Understanding? I apologize for the interruption, she said, her voice a low, resonant alto that carried to every corner of the room. But I believe there has been a misunderstanding, an unexpected guest. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a collective intake of breath that seemed to momentarily still the humid air. All eyes, previously glued to Michael Abernathy slumped in his chair, now followed the progress of the woman as she moved with quiet purpose towards the front. Judge Thaddeus Thompson, mid-scowl, momentarily lost his train of thought. He blinked, his face a mask of confused irritation. The woman wasn't young, her face etched with lines that spoke of experience and perhaps even hardship. But her posture was ramrod straight, her chin held high with an air of undeniable authority that transcended her simple, dark dress. She stopped just before the bar, separating the spectators from the court proper, her gaze sweeping across the room, lingering for a moment on Michael before settling on Judge Thompson. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the stagnant air like a bell. "I apologize for the interruption." Judge Thompson, regaining his composure, puffed out his chest. "Madam," he boomed, "this is highly irregular. Who are you, and what is the meaning of this intrusion?" A hush descended, so complete you could hear the faint whirring of the ceiling fan. The woman didn't flinch. She simply offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "My name is Eleanor Roosevelt." The silence that followed was profound, almost deafening. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on reality itself. Michael, who had been staring at the floor, lifted his head slowly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He risked a glance around the room. The court stenographer's fingers hovered motionless over her keyboard. A bailiff stood frozen, his hand halfway to his holstered gun. Judge Thompson's face had gone from red to a pasty white. He sputtered, trying to find his voice. "Eleanor Roosevelt?" He finally managed, his voice a strained whisper. "Yes," she confirmed, her tone gentle but firm. I am here to observe the proceedings. The room erupted, not into chaos, but into a low, buzzing hum of disbelief and speculation. The name hung in the air, heavy with its implications. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the president, a champion of the downtrodden. Here, in this backwater courtroom, observing the trial of a black man accused of stealing a loaf of bread. Judge Thompson, still visibly shaken, banged his gavel, a feeble attempt to restore order. "Mrs. Roosevelt," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual bluster, "while we are honored by your presence, I must insist that you understand that this is a court of law. We cannot allow ourselves to be distracted." Eleanor Roosevelt inclined her head. "Of course, Your Honor. I understand completely. I merely wish to observe. I assure you, I will not interfere with the course of justice." She moved to one of the benches, accepting a seat offered with trembling hands by a court employee. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on Judge Thompson, an unreadable expression on her face. Michael Abernathy stared at her, his mind reeling. Why was she here? What did she want? Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, flickered within him. Could this be some kind of intervention? A lifeline thrown into his despair? He dare not believe it. He had learned long ago that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, his gaze darting nervously between Mrs. Roosevelt and the jury. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The air of casual disdain that had permeated the room had vanished, replaced by a palpable tension, a sense of being watched, judged. He swallowed hard. The game had changed. He addressed the jury, his voice noticeably less confident than before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, as I was saying, but his words lacked their previous conviction. The weight of Eleanor Roosevelt's presence was a palpable thing, a silent accusation that hung in the air, forcing everyone to confront the stark reality of the situation. A black man on trial, facing probable jail time for stealing a loaf of bread. And the First Lady was watching. A voice for the voiceless. Michael Abernathy slumped deeper into the hard wooden chair, the accusation hanging in the air like the stale odor of dust and disappointment that permeated the courtroom. Stolen bread. That's all it amounted to. A loaf of rye, barely enough to fill his belly for a day. But the way Judge Thaddeus Thompson had thundered his judgment, you'd think Michael had pilfered the crown jewels. Then she walked in. Even in his despair, Michael noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. A hush fell, not the fearful silence Judge Thompson usually commanded, but a respectful quiet. The woman, tall and dignified, moved with an air of quiet authority. Her dress, a simple navy blue, spoke of practicality, not privilege. And her eyes, they held a warmth that felt foreign and welcome in this cold, unforgiving place. Judge Thompson, who had been red-faced and sputtering just moments before, now looked like a cornered rabbit. His scowl melted into a nervous smile, revealing teeth that suddenly seemed too large for his mouth. "Mrs. Roosevelt," he stammered, rising so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "What an unexpected honor." Eleanor Roosevelt offered a polite nod, her gaze sweeping over the room, lingering for a moment on Michael. "Judge Thompson," she replied, her voice clear and resonant. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." The judge swallowed hard. "A minor infraction, Mrs. Roosevelt. A simple case of petty theft. We were just concluding." "Indeed," she said, her tone suggesting she knew far more than she let on. "I heard a rather interesting story on my way here, Judge. A story about a young man who, despite his own hardships, makes it a habit to feed the birds each morning. A young man known for his kindness." Michael's head snapped up. How could she possibly know? He glanced around the room, searching for a familiar face, someone who might have spoken on his behalf. But he saw only the curious stares of onlookers and the increasingly panicked expression of Judge Thompson. "Abernathy, isn't it?" Mrs. Roosevelt's gaze met his, her eyes filled with genuine interest. "Michael Abernathy, I understand you have quite the following among the feathered community." A faint smile touched her lips. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, the sound like a rusty hinge. "Mrs. Roosevelt, I assure you, The boy is being dealt with appropriately. We can discuss this in my chambers, if you prefer. I prefer to hear Mr. Abernathy's side of the story, Judge Thompson. Here, now." The steel in her voice was unmistakable. The judge's face paled. He wrung his hands, glancing nervously at the spectators. He knew his reputation, his standing in the community, was crumbling before his eyes. Eleanor Roosevelt turned her full attention to Michael, her expression gentle and encouraging. "Mr. Abernathy," she said softly, "would you be willing to tell me what happened? Don't be afraid. Speak freely." A flicker of hope ignited within Michael's chest, a tiny spark in the darkness. He'd never spoken in court before, never dared to challenge the authority of the judge. But looking into Mrs. Roosevelt's kind eyes, he found a courage he didn't know he possessed. He took a deep breath, the stale air filling his lungs, and began to speak. Justice and compassion. Michael Abernathy stood straighter this time, the weight on his shoulders seeming a little lighter now that Eleanor was here. He swallowed, the dryness in his throat a familiar ache. He looked at her, a silent plea for strength. Her slight nod was enough. "Your Honor," he began, his voice less a tremor, more a declaration. "It weren't just bread. It was for my babies. My wife, Sarah, she passed last month from the consumption. Left me with 3 little ones, the youngest barely walking." He paused, the courtroom air thick with a sudden, uncomfortable silence. Judge Thompson shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight. "The mill closed, Your Honor. No work, no money. I tried everything. Asked for credit at the store, begged my neighbors. Nobody had anything to spare. Winter's coming, and my children, they were crying with hunger. Their little bellies were swollen with nothing but water." He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down his weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He wanted them to see, to understand. That loaf, it was the only way I could think to stop their crying. Just for one night. Just to give them something warm in their bellies. The courtroom was still. Even the bailiff seemed to have stilled his perpetual motion. Michael opened his eyes, meeting Judge Thompson's gaze. He saw not the amusement he'd expected, but a flicker of discomfort. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Eleanor rose, her presence filling the space beside him. She didn't touch him, didn't need to. Her quiet strength was a palpable force. She turned her attention to Judge Thompson. "Judge," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Mr. Abernathy has painted a clear picture of desperation, a father driven to extreme measures by unbearable circumstances. Are you truly unmoved by such suffering?" Judge Thompson stammered, adjusting his spectacles. "Madam Roosevelt, the law is the law. Theft cannot be condoned." Eleanor's lips tightened, a subtle but unmistakable sign of her displeasure. "The law, Judge, is a framework, not a cage. It is meant to serve justice, yes, but justice without compassion is a hollow victory. Where is the justice in punishing a man for trying to keep his children alive?" She stepped closer to the bench, her gaze unwavering. This courtroom should be a place of understanding, a place where the circumstances are weighed alongside the crime. It should reflect the values of our society, the values of decency and empathy. Are you truly demonstrating those values today, Judge? Judge Thompson's face was now flushed. He fumbled with the gavel, knocking it against the wooden surface with a sharp, jarring sound. He looked from Eleanor to Michael, then back to Eleanor, his eyes darting nervously. "Madam Roosevelt, I assure you, I am simply upholding my duty. Is it your duty to blindly follow procedure when a man's life, a family's future, hangs in the balance?" Eleanor's voice, though still quiet, now carried the weight of command. "Or is it your duty to seek a resolution that is both just and merciful?" He dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. His earlier arrogance evaporated. The courtroom, once a stage for his authority, now felt like a trap. He glanced around, searching for an escape, but found none. The eyes of everyone present were fixed on him, waiting. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the muffled sounds of the city outside. Finally, He cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. I need a moment. He rose abruptly and disappeared into his chambers, leaving the courtroom buzzing with anticipation. The air crackled with unspoken questions. What would he do? Would he listen to Eleanor's plea for compassion, or would he cling to the rigid letter of the law? Michael dared to hope, a fragile seed of optimism planted in the barren landscape of his despair. A judge's apology. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the suddenly hushed courtroom. He adjusted his spectacles, his gaze darting between the papers in front of him and Michael Abernathy, who stood ramrod straight, his face an unreadable mask of weary resignation. The air, thick with anticipation moments before, now felt brittle, like spun glass about to shatter. Mr. Abernathy, the judge began, his voice raspy, devoid of the usual booming authority. He fidgeted with the gavel, his knuckles white as he gripped it. Before we proceed further, I have something I need to say. A collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Even the court stenographer paused, her fingers hovering above the keys. Thompson swallowed hard. The words seemed to catch in his throat, refusing to be released. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him, the collective judgment a physical burden. He thought of his wife, Martha, her gentle face, her unwavering belief in fairness and compassion. He imagined her disappointment, her quiet disapproval. He looked directly at Michael. Mr. Abernathy, he repeated, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. I owe you an apology. A gasp escaped someone in the gallery, quickly stifled. Michael remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the judge, waiting. My conduct yesterday was reprehensible. I allowed prejudice and a lack of understanding to cloud my judgment. I failed to see you, to see your humanity. I was blinded by my own arrogance. His voice wavered, cracking slightly. He looked down at the papers, unable to maintain eye contact. There is no excuse for my behavior. No justificación. I was wrong. He raised his head, his gaze meeting Michael's. This time, there is no mockery, no disdain, only a raw, naked shame. I'm truly sorry, Mr. Abernathy, for the humiliation I caused you, for the pain I inflicted. I abused my position, and I deeply regret it. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Michael's expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing slightly. Judge Thompson took a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs. Therefore, he continued, his voice regaining a semblance of its former authority, it is my duty and my sincere desire to rectify my error. After reviewing the evidence and reflecting upon my own conduct, I find that there is insufficient evidence to proceed with this case. Furthermore, in light of the extenuating circumstances, I believe that pursuing these charges would be a grave injustice. He picked up the gavel, his hand trembling slightly. Therefore, he declared, his voice ringing through the courtroom, I hereby dismiss all charges against Mr. Michael Abernathy. This case is closed. A stunned silence hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then, like a dam bursting, the courtroom erupted. Applause thundered, echoing off the high ceilings. Cheers filled the room, a cacophony of relief and jubilation. People leaped to their feet, clapping, shouting, and embracing. Even some of the court officers allowed themselves a small smile. Michael Abernathy stood motionless for a moment, his face still unreadable. Then, slowly, a faint smile touched his lips. He nodded his head, a silent acknowledgement of the judge's apology and the crowd's support. He looked up at the gallery where his sister, Sarah, was weeping quietly, a handkerchief pressed to her face. Judge Thompson watched the scene unfold, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. He had made amends, as best he could, for his egregious error, but he knew that the damage he had done would not be easily forgotten. He lowered his head, a profound sense of humility settling over him. The applause continued, a wave of sound that both comforted and chastised him. He had a long way to go to earn back the respect he had so carelessly squandered. Bread for the birds. Michael Abernathy stood ramrod straight, the coarse weave of his thrift store suit an irritant against his skin. This was unfathomable. Eleanor Roosevelt's hand, surprisingly vital in its warmth, enveloped his. "Mr. Abernathy," she intoned, her voice a low, resonant current. "Anger is justified. Despair, understandable. But a responsibility rests upon you, too. To yourself, to your community, to that beloved bakery. Do not let bitterness lay claim to what is rightfully yours." He could only nod, a knot lodged firmly in his throat, impeding speech. Gratitude surged within him, a desperate urge to articulate its depth, yet words failed. He returned her squeeze, a voiceless pledge to persevere. Stepping away from the courthouse, the building's austere facade seemed to soften as a tentative sunbeam pierced the overcast sky. He flagged down a taxi, relaying the familiar address to the driver. The engines hum a welcome counterpoint to the day's turmoil. The wave of scent greeted him before he even fumbled with the bakery's lock, a heartening blend of proofing dough, toasted grain, and inviting warmth. It stood in stark opposition to the sterile chill of the courtroom. He inhaled deeply, a spark of something akin to resilience igniting within. Resolve now steeled his movements. He shrugged off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. The pliable resistance of the dough beneath his palms centered him, the rhythmic kneading a solace and a focus. He baked, more than just the standard fare for his clientele. He crafted smaller, denser rolls, perfectly sized for delicate beaks. He remembered the sparrows and finches that frequented the modest green space behind the bakery, their cheerful melodies a constant accompaniment to his labor. He would offer them a feast come morning. The day's ordeal replayed in Judge Thompson's mind, a skipping record needle stuck in a groove. First, the fleeting amusement, the cutting riposte, followed by the insidious creep of disquiet as whispers spread through the gallery. And finally, the thunderclap of Eleanor Roosevelt's entrance. His face flushed, recalling her measured pronouncements, the palpable weight of her disappointment. He tugged at his tie, the knot suddenly constricting. A tremor ran through his hands as he poured a generous measure of whiskey. A pre-dinner indulgence, yet tonight demanded something different. He paced his study, the gleaming parquet floor a resonant percussion beneath his weight. He had always held his fairness as a point of pride. Stern, perhaps, but equitable. He championed the law, upheld order. Yet today, he had allowed prejudice to taint his impartiality. He'd seen only a despondent black man, not a proprietor fighting to save his livelihood. Nausea coiled in his gut. What damage had he inflicted? He nearly destroyed a man's world through a momentary lapse into callous indifference. The realization struck him with the force of a blow. He slumped into his leather armchair, the tumbler of whiskey forgotten in his grip. His gaze remained fixed on the portrait of his father, a respected barrister, overlooking the hearth. Would the man in the painting approve of his actions today? He doubted it. He had to recalibrate, had to rise above this. He couldn't retract what had been done, but he could extract a lesson from it. Listen more intently. Judge with greater consideration. Strive to perceive the intrinsic worth of every soul who entered his courtroom, regardless of origin, status, or circumstance. He pushed himself upright, a new steel in his spine. Tomorrow would mark a fresh beginning. He would approach each case with an unbiased perspective, an empathetic spirit. He would embody the judicious figure he always envisioned, the one his father would acknowledge with pride. He faced the daunting challenge of confronting the courthouse atmosphere. The whispers would cling to him, a persistent shadow, and he would bear the burden of almost crushing an innocent man. He reached for the whiskey anew, his hand trembling even more violently now.